Good morning. How are you guys doing? Do you have any snow at your place? You know, we just heard on the news today that we're supposed to have snow for the next 2 days, maybe even a blizzard. So we'll see what happens. Now, before we get started on our story today, I want to show you a picture of a truck. Do you know what kind of a truck this is? This is a moving truck, and it's called a U-Haul because you haul everything that you have to the new place that you're moving to. Well, what is moving like? Is that exciting, or is it kind of like, I don't really know if I want to move kind of feeling? You know, I grew up, this is a map of Canada, and I grew up in Vancouver, Victoria. I had lived there all my life. And you know, one day my dad said, we're moving, and we are going to move to Calgary. Well, I didn't really know what to think about that because I had never been anywhere in Canada other than here. But I was kind of excited about it. So when we got to Calgary though, you know what? It was very brown and dusty. Not at all like BC. And they didn't seem to have as many nice trees or flowers. And you know, I started to miss the ocean and I started to miss my friends and I wanted to move back. I didn't want to stay in Calgary. But we couldn't move back. We had to stay there. But you know, after a while I made new friends and I began to like Calgary. And now I really like Calgary. But it wasn't easy at first. And you know, today our story is about moving. It's about a man called Abram, and God tells him to move somewhere that he didn't say where. So what is that all about? Let's find out. Well, this man's name was Abram, and he lived with his father, his brothers, his nephews and nieces, and his wife in a land called Ur. Now, I know that this map is small and it's hard to read the names, but this is where Ur is. It's called Ur of the Chaldees. This is where Abram lived. Now, Ur was a very powerful, wealthy city, and it was famous for worshiping idols. Yeah, idols. In fact, in Ur, they had built a ziggurat. Now, this is what a ziggurat looks like, and it's a temple dedicated to the worship of false gods and idols. It was enormous. It was 30 meters high. So if you want to know how high that is, you just get into an elevator and go to the 9th floor. You get out, look out the window, and you'll just see how high this ziggurat was. I mean, look how tiny the people look compared to how big this temple was. Idol worship was very important to the people of Ur. Now, somebody also made a painting of the ziggurat in Ur, and this painting shows you just how big it is compared to the rest of the city. I mean, temple worship of idols was so important to Ur. Now, the Bible tells us that Abram's father, Terah, was a worshiper of idols. But it doesn't tell us if Abram was. But Abram would be certainly influenced by that worship of idols. I mean, Abram, he did not know the one true God. But one day, God appeared to Abram, and this is what he said. I'm going to read it to you right from the Bible. He said to Abram, come out of this land, you and your family and relatives, and go to a land that I'll show you. And I'll bless you, and I'll give you a son and make a nation out of you. And all the world will be blessed because of you. Wow, that's pretty big. I mean, 1 minute you're minding your own business, and the next minute the one true God appears to you and tells you this? Well, what would Abram do? I mean, what would you do? Well, Abram believed God. And so Abram gathered up all of his relatives. That would be his father, his brothers, his wife, his nephews and nieces. And they started out. But to where? God didn't say. He didn't tell them where they were supposed to go. They were just to start out. Well, I mean, would that be hard, leaving everything that was familiar to him? I mean, would people think that he was crazy to do this? You know, as they started out, they might have been excited, but you know what? Every day was this. Every day was the same thing, just desert. I mean, where were they going? And when would they get there? I mean, God just had not said. I mean, Abram was a very wealthy man. His family was wealthy. They had a lot of servants. They had a lot of herdsmen because they had large flocks of cattle and sheep. So they were a big company of people just traveling through the desert. And you know, as they traveled every day, they just couldn't even see anything. They just didn't know where were they going to end up and how long was this going to take to get there. Well, they'd finally traveled quite a distance. They came up here through Babylon, which is where the Tower of Babel took place. They went right up here until they got to the land of Haran. When they got to Haran, the Bible says that they just settled there. They just stayed there. They lived there for quite a while. We don't know how long, but it was quite a while. I mean, Terah, the father, eventually died. And after he died, God appeared to Abram again. And he reminded Abram of his promises. He said, I want you to go, get up, take their households, and keep going. I'm giving you the land of Canaan, he told them. Well, Abram did. He got up his households together. I mean, they had grown even larger because they had lived there for quite a while. They had more sheep, more cattle. Lot had gotten married. He had children. There was just a lot of them, but they all got up and they started traveling again. So now, from Haran, they start to come down this way. And they came down until they got to a place called Shechem. And in Shechem, along the road, is this great oak tree of Moreh, it's called. You know, this tree is still there today. And people will still come and visit it and see it. It's along a well-traveled pathway, a road, and there's a lot of water by there. But when Abram got there, God appeared to him again, and he reminded Abram again. He said, I'm taking you to the land of Canaan, and out of your son, I'm going to make a great nation. But Abram didn't have a son. I mean, he and Sarah had been married for a long time, and they didn't have any children. I mean, Lot had gotten married and had children right away, but not Abram and Sarai. But Abram believed God, and so he built an altar of praise and worship to this God. And he went a little further to Bethel, and he built another altar, and he asked God for wisdom. Well, they kept traveling until they got to Canaan. But you know what? When they got to Canaan, there was a famine in the land. I mean, a famine means that there is not enough food for people to eat. I mean, look at it. It's so hot and dry. Nothing is growing. There's no crops. There's no food. I mean, Abram looked around. His household was huge. Lot's household was huge. I mean, what were they supposed to do? There's no food. But you know what? Abram didn't ask God what to do. Abram thought to himself, we are going to go down to Egypt. Now, Egypt is here. So you can see that they came all the way down to Egypt. Now, Egypt is a very different country. Abram had left Ur, which worshipped idols. But you know, in Egypt, they worshipped thousands of idols. They had thousands of idols and false gods. Now, here's a picture of what some of their gods might have looked like. Yeah. They all had names. In fact, there were so many gods that they didn't even know the names of all these gods. Well, what was Abram doing? Well, you know, Egypt is ruled by a pharaoh that's like a king. Now, Abram knew that pharaohs take many wives, and Sarai was very beautiful. And he was afraid that Pharaoh might kill Abram and take Sarai for his wife. And so he said to Sarai, listen, you are so beautiful that when we get to Egypt, I want you to tell people that you're my sister, that you're not my wife. Well, that's a lie. But Abram was afraid. Now the Bible tells us when this great company of Abram and Lot's households came into Egypt, the princes of Pharaoh noticed that Sarai was very beautiful. And they told Pharaoh about her. And so Pharaoh brought Sarai into his house, which is like his palace. And he treated Abram very well because of Sarai. In fact, this is what the Bible says. He says that Pharaoh gave him oxen and donkeys and camels and sheep and servants because he was so pleased with Sarai. I mean, things were turning out pretty good. But Abram should not have been there, and God was not happy. God had taken Abram out of a city full of idols, and now Abram had put himself into a country that worshipped thousands of false idols and gods. And he'd lied. Well, what do you think God did with that? Because of that, because of what Abram had done, he caused Pharaoh and everyone in Pharaoh's household to come down with terrible diseases. And finally, Pharaoh realized none of this had happened until he had taken Sarai into his palace. And he was angry. And he called Abram up in front of him and he said, "What have you done? Why did you tell me she's your sister when she's not? She's your wife." Now he said, "Go, get out of here, leave Egypt, and don't come back." Well, that was a rebuke by Pharaoh. People had suffered consequences because of Abram's sin. They had suffered terrible diseases. And Abram was also embarrassed in front of his family, his relatives, and his servants because he had claimed to be a man of God. And look what he had done. Look what had happened. But even though Abram disobeyed God, it did not stop God from carrying out his plans and his promises to Abram. He rescued them from Egypt and brought them back into Canaan. And so even though he had disobeyed, God was still watching over him. So what I want you to remember from today's story is that God called Abram out of his city into a new life to follow him, to worship him. And God calls you and I today through his word. Through his word, the Bible. That's how God calls us. And he calls us to believe in Jesus, his son. Because when we do, God gives us a new life as well. Okay, see you next time.